We begin our story in the freezing, violent waters of the North Pacific, just off the coast of Alaska. The men aboard the St. Peter, led by Captain Vitus Bering, had just become the first Europeans to officially verify the coast of Alaska, but there was no celebration on deck. They were sick, exhausted, and desperately trying to return to the Russian port of Petropavlovsk before the winter storms swallowed them whole. For Bering, this was the culmination of his life's work. It was his second major expedition to find the path to America, an undertaking of insane scale. Known as the Great Northern Expedition, the preparations took nearly a decade. Supplies had to be hauled across the mountains and swamps of all of Siberia to the Pacific coast. The ships took years to assemble. By the time Bering finally set sail in June of 1741, he was 60 years old, physically broken, and likely suffering from depression. When they found America, the triumph was short-lived. They touched land only briefly, just long enough to verify that they were indeed in North America before bad weather conditions forced them to turn back. But Vitus Bering would not make it back to Russia. Lost in the fog and battered by storms, the St. Peter was wrecked on a desolate, treeless island. The ship was destroyed, trapping the crew in a frozen hellscape for the winter. There, Bering would meet his end. The island would later be named in his honor, Bering Island. Some of the crew managed to survive by relying on the meat of sea otters and eventually made it back to Kamchatka. While they didn't return with gold or spices, their journey was not for nothing. They brought back the thick, waterproof pelts of the sea otters they had eaten to survive. These pelts promised a fortune, the allure of which would doom countless more souls to chase their wealth in this unforgiving and miserable corner of the planet. In the 18th century, sea otter pelt was becoming an increasingly popular luxury item, especially in China. In the Qing dynasty court, it was the status symbol of the era. It was known as the royal fur, used to line the silk robes of mandarins and trim the caps of high officials. Wealthy noblewomen wore otter capes adorned with pearls. The fur of the sea otter is one of the densest in the animal kingdom. It is softer than sable, and unlike other furs, it remains waterproof and incredibly warm even in the dampest conditions. Additionally, it's incredibly durable. Russian merchants would transport these pelts thousands of miles to China. There, they were sold for astronomical sums in exchange for tea, silk, and porcelain. A single high-quality skin could trade for enough to set a man up for life, earning the otter pelt the nickname soft gold. Naturally, many bought into the dream, and men from northern Russia and Siberia began pouring east. These men became known as the Promyshlenniki. They weren't disciplined soldiers or noble explorers. They were rugged frontiersmen, Cossacks, and contract laborers. They were a rough breed, many debt-ridden and desperate, signing contracts that effectively owned them for years, all for the chance to grab a piece of the fortune. They would build crude ships out of whatever wood they could find on the Pacific coast, sometimes holding the planks together with leather thongs instead of nails, and set sail eastwards. Not in the name of the Tsar, but in hopes of quick profit, they hopped from island to island along the Aleutian chain, moving further and further east, chasing the otters. By the late 1700s, they had established a permanent, if fragile, foothold in the New World. It was a colony born not out of a desire to settle, but out of a hunger to harvest. But there was a problem. With most of them coming from the Russian north and Siberia, they knew how to survive the Alaskan climate, but had no experience at hunting in the open ocean. As such, they had a very hard time catching the sea otter, which lived in the violent surf of the Pacific. Luckily for them, they didn't need to look far to find someone more skilled at otter hunting than them. Living on the volcanic archipelago that stretches between Alaska and Siberia, the Aleuts were masters of this hostile environment. They hunted in baidarkas, waterproof skin kayaks that were light, incredibly fast, and capable of navigating storms that would sink a heavy European longboat. The Aleuts could strike a sea otter with a harpoon from 50 yards away in rolling swells. They possessed the skill the Russians lacked. Initially, the Russians engaged in trade with the Aleuts, However, over time, they resorted to a different approach, which became known as amanat. They would land their ships at an Aleut village and immediately seize the women and children, holding them hostage at gunpoint. They then issued an ultimatum to the men: bring us a specific quota of furs, often hundreds of pelts, or you will never see your families again. Forced to choose between their lives and their kin, the Aleut hunters were driven to the brink of exhaustion. They were made to hunt in dangerous weather, leading to countless drownings. The cost of this soft gold was catastrophic. Between the violence, the forced labor, and the diseases brought by the Europeans, the Aleut population collapsed. Within the first 2 generations of Russian contact, it is estimated that their numbers plummeted by nearly 80%. By the end of the 18th century, the Aleutian Islands had stripped bare, the sea otters were gone, and the Aleut workforce was decimated. To keep the business alive, the Russians had to push further east toward the mainland of North America, but there they would face 2 enemies that were far more serious than the Aleuts. As the 19th century dawned, the Russian approach to America was changing. The era of the Promyshlenniki was ending as large trade companies emerged, eventually leading to the creation of a united Russian-American company, with Alexander Baranov becoming Russian America's first governor. Baranov was a merchant with a soul of iron, sent to bring order to the chaos. He integrated the loose hunters into a rigid company, and after establishing a foothold on Kodiak Island, he pushed the operation south into the dense rain-soaked islands of the Alexander Archipelago. There, in 1799, a fort called Redoubt St. Michael was established, thus bringing the Russians into Tlingit territory. Unlike the Aleuts, the Tlingit were not a scattered population of peaceful hunters. They were a powerful, wealthy warrior society with established trade networks. Crucially, they were armed. Through trade with British and American ships, the Tlingit had acquired muskets, gunpowder, and cannons. They wore armor made of thick wooden slats that could deflect bullets given enough distance. For a while, the Tlingit tolerated the Russian presence in the area, but that didn't last. In June 1802, Tlingit warriors launched a surprise attack, overwhelmed the garrison, and burned the settlement to the ground. Baranov returned 2 years later with a proper navy in an attempt to regain control of the area. For days, the Tlingit held their fortress against Russian cannon fire, but eventually they withdrew, slipping away into the forest to fight another day. A new capital was built on the ashes, receiving the name Novoarkhangelsk. The Russians won, but the Tlingit were not fully defeated, and for the next 60 years, the Russians lived surrounded by a hostile tribe, terrified to walk into the forest alone. While the Tlingit threatened them from the tree line, the Russians faced a different enemy from within the walls. The archipelago is spectacular to look at, but it is a nightmare for agriculture. The ground is a sponge of acidic moss and rock. Potatoes rotted in the mud, and wheat refused to grow. The colony was dependent on imported food, but the supply line was a logistical nightmare. To get a sack of flour to Alaska, it had to travel from St. Petersburg, around Africa, and over the Pacific. The journey took over a year. By the time provisions arrived, the flour was a brick of mold and the butter was rancid. Desperate, the Russians looked south to the Spanish territory of California. In 1812, they established Fort Ross just north of San Francisco. The goal was simple: turn California into the agricultural breadbasket of the empire. But bad fortune followed them south. They chose a location plagued by coastal fog. The wheat crops failed year after year. The gophers ate what little was able to grow. Instead of a breadbasket, Fort Ross became a financial black hole. By 1841, the Russians gave up on California. They sold the fort and all its equipment to an American settler named John Sutter for a mere $30,000. With the California experiment a failure, the Russians were forced to swallow their imperial pride. They turned to their greatest rival in the region, the British. In 1839, the Russian-American company signed a contract with the British Hudson's Bay Company. The British agreed to supply the colony with wheat, beef and butter from their own farms in the south. The immediate threat of starvation was over, but the reality was bitter. The Russian colony was no longer self-sufficient. It was now surviving entirely on the mercy of its enemies. By the 1860s, the Russian Empire was exhausted. The commercial extinction of the sea otter meant the company became less profitable. Worse, the Crimean War had left Russia humiliated and bankrupt. Concerns were raised that in the event of another war, the British Navy, stationed just across the border in Canada, could simply sail in and take Alaska for free. Russia couldn't defend it. So they decided to sell it to Britain's rival, the United States. The deal was struck in 1867. The price was $7.2 million, roughly 2 cents an acre, an absolute bargain for an entire subcontinent. On October 18, 1867, the transfer ceremony took place in Novoarkhangelsk. The mood was somber. There were no cheers from the Russian side, only the quiet realization of defeat. The Russian tricolor was lowered from the flagpole and the stars and stripes were raised. With that simple exchange, 126 years of history came to an end. The indigenous peoples, who were never consulted, were transferred to a new owner. The Russian settlers were given a choice: become Americans or go home. Most went home. Within months, the empire had packed up and left, leaving behind only their church, their names, and the memories of a dream that never quite came true.